She thought she had power. She thought she was in control. But in just 5 minutes, everything she built would come crashing down. A flight attendant made the worst mistake of her career when she kicked an elderly woman off a plane, never realizing who she had just humiliated. What happened next? No one saw coming. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Emma Carter adjusted the cuffs of her perfectly pressed uniform as she stood at the entrance of the plane, her polished shoes clicking against the cabin floor. She had worked as a flight attendant for years, rising through the ranks with strict discipline and a no-nonsense attitude. In her mind, authority belonged to those who enforced the rules, and today she was about to make an example out of someone who, in her eyes, didn't belong. Passengers were still settling into their seats when Margaret Lane stepped into the plane. She was frail, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the handle of her small carry-on bag. Her faded coat looked worn but clean, her silver hair neatly pulled back, and her soft eyes scanned the cabin as if searching for something familiar. She moved slowly, carefully placing each step forward. She didn't have the rush of the younger passengers or the confidence of the frequent travelers, but there was something in the way she held herself, something calm, something steady. Emma barely glanced at her before assuming she was in the wrong place. She had seen it before. Elderly passengers confused about their seats, asking too many questions, slowing down the boarding process. She stepped forward, her voice clipped and professional, stopping Margaret before she could go any further. "Ma'am, are you sure you're on the right flight?" Emma asked, her tone more of a statement than a genuine question. Margaret gave a small nod, reaching into her coat pocket with careful fingers and pulling out a neatly folded boarding pass. She held it out politely, her voice soft. "I believe I have seat 2A. Emma took the ticket, barely looking at it before shaking her head. "This is first class," she said, as if explaining something too complicated for the woman to understand. "Economy is further back." Margaret's lips pressed together, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, her voice quiet but certain. A small pause filled the air, passengers shifting in their seats as a few nearby overheard the exchange. Emma forced a smile, her patience thinning. "There must be a mistake," she said, handing the ticket back. "First class is for premium passengers." Margaret didn't argue. She simply stood there, as if waiting for Emma to realize her mistake. The moment stretched too long, the silence heavy, and Emma exhaled sharply. She didn't have time for this. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside so we can begin takeoff procedures." Her tone had changed now, firmer, less patient. Margaret took a slow breath, glancing down at her ticket once more, before looking back up. "I paid for this seat," she repeated. The tension grew. A few passengers had stopped pretending to look at their phones, their gazes shifting toward the front. Emma squared her shoulders. "I need you to move," she said, a slight edge in her voice now. "If you don't, I'll have to ask you to leave the plane." Margaret didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't push back. She simply reached down, picked up her bag, and gave Emma one last look before turning toward the exit. Emma felt a wave of satisfaction. She had handled the situation quickly, removed the disruption, and maintained order. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that in just 5 minutes, she would be the one leaving this plane, and it wouldn't be by choice. Emma watched as Margaret slowly walked toward the exit, her frail hands gripping the strap of her bag. The older woman didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't even glance back. Emma saw this as proof that she had been right. Just another confused passenger who didn't belong in first class. She turned back toward the cabin, adjusting her uniform with a satisfied breath. The boarding process had already taken too long, and now that the issue was handled, they could move on. But something felt off. A low murmur had begun spreading through the first-class cabin. Passengers weren't settling in like usual. A few were whispering, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One man in particular, seated in one seat, had gone completely still. His hands were folded over his lap, his face unreadable, but his jaw was clenched so tight that a vein pulsed at his temple. Emma recognized him vaguely. A well-dressed man, early 40s, broad shoulders, and an air of authority that didn't come from wealth alone. There was something about him, something about the way he sat completely motionless, that made her uneasy. The whispers grew louder. A woman in 3A tapped on her husband's arm and pointed toward the jet bridge where Margaret was being assisted by a gate agent. Did she really just get kicked off? She muttered. Another passenger across the aisle frowned. She had a first-class ticket, he said. I saw it. She wasn't in the wrong. Emma felt irritation bubbling inside her. She had seen passengers get worked up over situations like this before. They always assumed they knew better. They didn't understand the logistics, the policies, the importance of keeping things in order. This was just another example of that. She plastered on a professional smile, the kind that barely touched her eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience as we prepare for takeoff, she said smoothly. There was a seating issue, but everything is now resolved. But the tension in the air didn't ease. The man in 1C, the one who hadn't moved an inch since Margaret was forced off the plane, suddenly let out a slow breath. Then, without a word, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Emma tensed. Sir, I need you to remain seated, she said quickly, stepping forward. But the man didn't even acknowledge her. He turned, walked past her without hesitation, and made his way toward the cockpit. The first officer, who had stepped out briefly to check on final preparations, immediately straightened when he saw him approaching. And then, in a voice so calm it sent a chill down Emma's spine, the man said only 5 words. Where is the flight captain? A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin. Emma's stomach twisted into a tight knot. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The first officer swallowed and nodded toward the cockpit door. Right inside, sir. Emma's breath caught. Sir? Her eyes darted to the nameplate clipped to the man's blazer, and in an instant, her entire body went cold. Daniel Lane. A name she had heard before, a name she should have recognized immediately, a name that didn't just belong to any passenger, it belonged to the CEO of the airline. Emma's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her throat went dry as Daniel Lane disappeared into the cockpit, the door shutting firmly behind him. The whispers among the passengers turned into full-blown murmurs now, some exchanging wide-eyed glances, others subtly reaching for their phones. She felt the shift in energy like a wave crashing over her. This wasn't just an uncomfortable situation anymore. This was something far worse. Emma forced herself to breathe, her fingers tightening around the edge of a nearby seat as she tried to think. Daniel Lane, the CEO of the airline. Margaret Lane, the elderly woman she had just forced off the plane. A sick realization twisted in her stomach. She had just kicked the mother of the CEO off a flight. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall, smoothing the front of her uniform as if that would somehow fix the disaster she had just created. Maybe he wouldn't make a scene. Maybe he'd handle this quietly. But deep down, she already knew the truth. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers frozen over the controls. The moment Daniel Lane entered, the air inside the small space turned suffocatingly tense. Mr. Lane, the captain said cautiously, straightening, I wasn't aware you were on board today. Daniel's expression didn't change. I didn't want special treatment, he said, his voice eerily calm. But now I need to know exactly what just happened on this flight. The captain's jaw tensed. Sir, I believe there was a misunderstanding with seating assignments. One of our flight attendants. Daniel cut him off with a single raise of his hand. Don't waste my time, he said flatly. I want her name. The first officer hesitated. Her name. Daniel's voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. The captain swallowed. Emma Carter, sir. Daniel nodded once, as if locking that name into his mind. Then he exhaled slowly and reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a few quick taps, he sent a single message. Back in the cabin, Emma's own phone buzzed in her pocket. At first, she ignored it. There were more important things to worry about. But then she felt another buzz, and another. When she finally pulled it out, her breath caught in her throat. The message on the crew's communications system was clear, sent directly from executive headquarters. Effective immediately, Emma Carter is relieved of duty. She is to be removed from this flight. Emma's stomach dropped so fast it felt like she was in free fall. Passengers were still watching, waiting, sensing something was happening, but not fully understanding just how bad it was. She forced herself to move, stepping quickly toward the cockpit door. She had to fix this. She had to explain. But just as she reached for the handle, the door swung open. Daniel Lane stepped out, and when his icy gaze locked onto hers, Emma finally understood. This wasn't just a warning. This was the end of her career. Emma felt her entire body tense as Daniel Lane stepped forward. His cold, unwavering gaze locked onto her. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some passengers leaned in, others subtly angled their phones, pretending to check notifications, but likely recording everything. The tension was unbearable. Emma forced a polite, professional smile, even as panic clawed at her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to do something, but Daniel spoke first. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice controlled, measured, but carrying a weight that sent a chill down her spine. "Do you understand what you've just done?" Emma's fingers twitched at her sides. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding. I was simply following protocol." Daniel let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. "Protocol?" His tone was almost amused, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what protocol states that a first-class ticketed passenger should be removed from a flight?" Emma swallowed hard. I thought there was a mistake with the seating." Daniel's expression didn't change. "And did you bother to check before humiliating my mother in front of an entire plane?" The words hit her like a slap. The whispers around her grew louder. More passengers were openly staring now, some with wide eyes, others shaking their heads. Emma struggled to steady her voice. "Sir, I assure you, I never meant any disrespect. I simply—" "Stop!" Daniel's voice was sharp, final. Emma's breath hitched. "You didn't just disrespect her," Daniel continued, his voice lowering slightly. "You dismissed her. You humiliated her. You made an assumption about her based on nothing but your own arrogance." Emma felt her stomach twist violently. Daniel glanced at his watch, then turned to Captain Hayes, who was standing just behind him, looking more tense than ever. "How much time until takeoff?" 10 minutes, sir," the captain said quickly. Daniel gave a slow nod before turning back to Emma. "Then that gives you just enough time to collect your belongings and remove yourself from this flight." Emma's breath stopped short. "Number—" "Wait," she said quickly, stepping forward. "Mr. Lane, please. I've worked for this airline for years. This was a misunderstanding. If I had known—" "You didn't bother to know," Daniel cut in, his eyes like steel. "You assumed, and because of that, you no longer work for this airline." Emma's stomach plummeted. The finality in his words was suffocating. She felt heat rise in her face as her hands clenched into fists. "This isn't fair," she blurted before she could stop herself. "I was just doing my job." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Your job?" His voice was dangerously calm. "Let me be clear, Miss Carter. Your job was to serve and assist passengers, not decide who is worthy of being in first class." Emma felt every pair of eyes in the cabin pressing down on her. Daniel turned toward the gate agent standing near the entrance. "Get another flight attendant up here to replace her," he said smoothly. "Miss Carter's no longer needed." Emma's heart pounded. This couldn't be happening. But then, before she could say another word, another crew member stepped forward from the galley. An attendant she recognized. Hannah. Someone newer, someone she had once trained herself. Hannah hesitated, glancing between Emma and Daniel, before stepping up to take her place at the front of the cabin. Emma's face burned. They had already replaced her. A lump formed in her throat. Passengers were whispering, some nodding in agreement, others just watching the spectacle unfold. This was humiliation. This was punishment. And worst of all, this was just the beginning. Emma's hands clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails dug into her palms. The cabin was so silent that even the soft rustling of a passenger shifting in their seat felt deafening. Her body felt stiff, like she was frozen in place. But the reality of what was happening crashed into her like a tidal wave. She had been fired, right here, in front of everyone. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Mr. Lane," she tried again, her voice slightly unsteady but still laced with the same authority she had always carried. "I have given years to this airline. I have followed every rule, enforced every policy, upheld the highest standards. I—" Daniel raised a hand. "And yet in all those years, you never learned the most important lesson." Emma's mouth clamped shut. "Respect," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Not just for the rules, not just for procedures, but for the people you claim to serve." The weight of his words pressed against her chest like a stone. She had always prided herself on her authority, on how she ran her flights with strict discipline. But now, standing in front of the CEO, surrounded by passengers who were all watching her fall, that authority meant nothing. The murmurs were growing again. Emma could feel the shift, the way passengers were now actively against her. It wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was clear to everyone. She was the villain of this flight. The captain cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, I need you to step aside so we can proceed with takeoff." Emma's throat tightened. Step aside. Just like that, she was being erased, discarded like she was nothing. She turned, searching for anyone in the crew who might stand up for her. But no one moved, no one spoke. Her gaze locked onto Hannah, the young flight attendant who had taken her place. Emma had trained her. She had guided her through her first few flights. Surely Hannah would at least say something. But Hannah only gave her a hesitant, apologetic look before lowering her gaze. Emma's stomach churned. Daniel sighed, adjusting the cuff of his blazer before speaking again. "Miss Carter, I won't repeat myself. You are relieved of duty. You will leave this plane now." The way he said it, so calm, so final, it was like she wasn't even worth his time anymore. Heat rushed to her face, a mix of humiliation and desperation. If she left this plane, it would be over. Her job, her reputation, everything. She forced a tight smile, gripping on to the last shreds of control she had left. "I understand you're upset, sir, but maybe we can discuss this after the flight." Daniel's gaze darkened. "There is nothing to discuss." Emma opened her mouth again, ready to fight, ready to do anything to stop this from happening. But before she could say another word, 2 uniformed security officers stepped through the aircraft door. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was happening. She wasn't just being fired. She was being escorted off the plane. The realization settled over her like a suffocating weight. The gas from the passengers, the low hum of people whispering, the barely concealed smirks from those who had witnessed everything. It was all too much. Emma's vision blurred for a second, her breath coming in uneven bursts. This wasn't just a disciplinary action. This was a public execution, and she had nowhere left to run. Emma stood frozen in place as the 2 security officers positioned themselves near the entrance. Their presence was a silent command, a message that there was no more room for debate. She was leaving this plane, whether she accepted it or not. A strange ringing filled her ears, drowning out the whispers of the passengers. She knew they were watching, waiting for her to break, for her to lash out, to fight back. Some were smirking, enjoying the show. Others were shaking their heads, murmuring about how quickly things had spiraled out of control. Emma could feel the walls closing in on her. She had spent years commanding the rules, ensuring that every passenger followed protocol. She had been the one to enforce order. Now she was the one being removed. Her mouth felt dry, but she swallowed down her pride and tried one last time. "Mr. Lane," she said carefully, forcing a polite smile even as her fingers trembled. "I think we can both agree that this situation got out of hand. I assure you I would never intentionally disrespect a passenger, especially not someone as important as your mother. I take full responsibility for the misunderstanding, but I believe a termination, especially one so public, may be an overreaction." Daniel didn't blink. She continued, desperate to keep her voice steady. "I have been a dedicated employee for over a decade. My record speaks for itself. I have upheld this airline's standards with nothing but professionalism." Daniel sighed, shaking his head slightly as he looked at her. But there was no sympathy in his expression. "Professionalism?" he repeated, almost amused. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the first-class passengers. "Tell me, Miss Carter, do you believe they saw professionalism when you threw my mother off this flight?" Emma flinched. He let the silence stretch between them, forcing her to absorb the weight of his words. "You call this an overreaction? he continued. "I call this accountability." Emma's breath hitched. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just slightly. But somehow, that made his words even sharper. "You've spent years enforcing the rules, making passengers feel small when they made a mistake, using your position to assert dominance rather than offer service. Now you're the one on the other side. How does it feel?" The words hit like a slap. Emma's chest tightened. This was getting worse by the second. She had expected anger, frustration, maybe even some kind of legal action, but not this level of humiliation. She tried again, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I know I made a mistake." Daniel gave her a long, measured look. "No, you don't," he said, "because if you did, you wouldn't be standing here trying to negotiate your way out of it." Emma felt the air leave her lungs. She had no more arguments left. He wasn't going to change his mind. One of the security officers stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Carter, we need you to collect your belongings." Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her belongings, as if she were just another passenger being asked to leave. A sharp, bitter taste filled her mouth as she realized this was real. This was happening. Her stomach churned as she turned toward the small flight attendant storage area, where her bag was neatly tucked away with the other crew's belongings. She reached for it, her fingers stiff, her movements robotic. The weight of it felt heavier than usual. She turned back to the cabin, her grip tightening around the strap as she took in the scene around her. Passengers were staring. Some pretended to look at their phones, but she knew the truth. They were recording this. This wasn't just a private firing. This was a public disgrace. Her pulse raced as she realized something even worse. This wasn't just about losing her job. She was about to go viral. Tomorrow, her face would be plastered across the internet. Headlines would read, "Flight attendant kicks elderly woman off plane, gets fired on the spot." People would share it, comment on it, laugh at it. She would be a joke. Her hands felt ice cold as she forced herself to move toward the exit. The security officers didn't touch her, didn't force her, but their presence was enough. She stepped toward the open door, feeling the heat of humiliation rise in her chest as she passed by the first-class cabin. That's when she saw her. Margaret Lane sat quietly in the airport wheelchair near the jet bridge, her small hands resting on her lap. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She simply watched as Emma was escorted off the plane, the very same way she had been minutes ago. But there was no smugness in her gaze, no triumph, just disappointment. That somehow was worse. Emma's breath stuttered. She had spent the last few minutes desperately fighting for her job, her pride, her career, but she had never once apologized to the woman she had humiliated. And now, it was too late. Daniel Lane's voice rang behind her, sealing her fate with chilling finality. "Miss Carter, I suggest you enjoy this moment, because this will be the last time you ever step foot on one of my planes." Emma stepped over the threshold, feeling the weight of every single passenger's stare pressing into her back. And then the doors closed behind her. Her career was over. Emma barely heard the doors seal shut behind her. The soft click echoed in her ears, final and irreversible. The cool air from the jet bridge was a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension she had just left behind in the cabin. Every step forward felt heavier than the last, her grip tightening around the handle of her bag as she forced herself to keep walking. She wasn't sure where she was supposed to go. Security wasn't dragging her, but they didn't need to. The weight of her own humiliation pushed her forward, step by agonizing step, as she followed the narrow corridor leading back into the airport terminal. Passengers in the waiting area were still moving about, chatting, checking their phones, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. But as she stepped out of the jet bridge, she saw a few heads turn. Some recognized her. Some had watched her remove Margaret from the plane just minutes ago, and now they were watching her. Emma felt her chest tighten as she caught sight of Margaret Lane, still seated in the airport wheelchair near the gate. She was speaking softly to a staff member, her voice calm, her expression unreadable. Emma should have looked away. She should have kept walking, kept her head high, acted like she still had some control. But she couldn't. Her eyes locked onto Margaret's, and for a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The older woman's gaze wasn't cold, It wasn't triumphant. It was just disappointed. That single look shattered whatever remaining defenses Emma had left. She had spent her entire career believing she knew best, that she had the authority to dictate who deserved what. But standing here now in front of the very woman she had wronged, she felt small. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. What was she supposed to say? What apology could possibly undo what had just happened? Margaret didn't wait for her to figure it out. She simply gave her a slow nod, then turned her attention back to the airline staff, as if Emma no longer existed. And maybe in the world of aviation, she didn't. Emma barely registered the airline supervisor approaching her. A young woman in a neatly pressed navy blue suit, holding a company-issued tablet against her chest, her expression stiff and unreadable. "Miss Carter?" the supervisor asked, though it wasn't really a question. Emma forced herself to look at her. "Yes." The supervisor's fingers moved across the tablet screen as she spoke. "Per executive orders, you are no longer employed with this airline. You are required to return all company-issued property, including your uniform, ID badge, and access credentials." Emma's stomach twisted violently. Right now?" The supervisor's gaze barely flickered. "Yes. A security officer will escort you to the crew lounge where you can change out of your uniform. Once that's done, you will be escorted off the premises." Emma inhaled sharply through her nose. "Is there going to be—" She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Some kind of review? A formal hearing?" The supervisor's lips pressed together in something close to pity. "Mr. Lane has already made his decision. There will be no hearing." Emma felt her hands tremble slightly. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stand straighter. "I'll need a letter of termination." The supervisor nodded, already anticipating the request. "It's been sent to your company email. Your employee file has been updated. Your access to all airline systems has been revoked." A cold chill ran through Emma's spine. They had wiped her out that fast. The realization sank in like a stone in her stomach. They didn't just fire her, they erased her. Her employee number would no longer exist in the system. Her name would be flagged in HR databases across every major airline. If she tried to apply for another job in the industry, this incident would follow her everywhere. Her breath quickened. "Miss Carter," the supervisor said, her voice professional, clipped, mercilessly efficient. "This way, please." Emma turned, her feet carrying her toward the crew lounge like a prisoner walking to their execution. The long corridors she had walked for years now felt foreign. The airport, once a place she had moved through with confidence, now felt like hostile territory. She passed other crew members, pilots, flight attendants, ground staff, some who recognized her, some who only gave her a passing glance before whispering to one another as soon as she was out of earshot. The walk to the crew lounge felt like a public humiliation parade. By the time she stepped inside, her entire body felt numb. The lounge was nearly empty, a few flight attendants grabbing coffee before their next flights, some scrolling through their phones. But when she walked in, all movement stopped. A young flight attendant named Laura, someone Emma had worked with on several flights, blinked in surprise. "Emma!" Emma didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she moved toward the lockers, her fingers fumbling as she entered her passcode on the small keypad. The lock didn't click open. Her access had already been revoked. Her own locker wouldn't open for her anymore. A lump formed in her throat as she turned to the supervisor standing nearby. The woman sighed, tapping a few things into her tablet before unlocking the locker remotely. Emma forced her shaking hands to move quickly, grabbing her spare clothes from the top shelf. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't want to see their expressions. She stepped into the changing room, locking the door behind her. For a long moment, she just stood there. The flight attendant uniform she had once worn with such pride, the one that had given her power, now felt suffocating. With stiff, robotic movements, she unpinned her name badge from her chest and set it down on the small counter. It felt like taking off a part of herself. Her hands trembled as she pulled off the crisp navy blue blazer, unfastened the silk scarf from around her neck, and changed into the plain, nondescript clothes she had worn to the airport that morning. When she finally looked at her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She wasn't Emma Carter, senior flight attendant anymore. She was just Emma, and she had never felt so small. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. "Miss Carter," the supervisor's voice called out. "We need your uniform." Emma took one last shaky breath before unlocking the door and stepping out. She handed over the neatly folded uniform, her badge, her employee ID, everything that had once defined her. The supervisor took it without emotion, then nodded to the waiting security officer. "Escort her to the exit." Emma felt the final sting of reality sink in. This wasn't just about losing a job. She had lost everything: her power, her reputation, her career. She wasn't just being removed from the airline, she was being erased from the entire industry. And there was nothing left for her to hold on to. Emma didn't speak as she followed the security officer out of the crew lounge. The world around her felt distant, like she was walking through a fog. The same corridors she had marched down with authority now felt like unfamiliar terrain. She had walked through this airport thousands of times, boarding flights, commanding her crew, enforcing policies with absolute confidence. But now she was just another person being escorted out. Every step she took carried the weight of finality. There was no return, no last-minute reprieve, no chance to undo what had already been set in motion. Her job, her reputation, her career, all gone in less than an hour. She could feel the stares as she walked. Some from crew members who had heard whispers of what had happened, others from passengers who had unknowingly witnessed her downfall. The terminal was buzzing with the usual airport energy, people rushing to catch flights, families reuniting, workers going about their daily routines. But for Emma, everything had stopped. Her throat was dry as she finally reached the main exit. The security officer beside her kept a neutral expression, neither pitying nor cruel, just efficient. Another task to complete. "Miss Carter," he said, stopping just before the sliding doors that led to the outside world. "This is where we part ways." Emma felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. "That's it?" she asked, her voice hollow. The officer gave a slow nod. "Your termination has been processed. You are no longer authorized to enter any employee-designated areas of this airport." Her stomach twisted. Not just fired, banned. The security officer hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to say more. Then after a long pause, he spoke. "I'd suggest finding another line of work," he said quietly. This is going to follow you." Emma felt a fresh wave of nausea rise in her chest. She didn't need to be told that. She already knew. Her grip tightened around the strap of her bag, but her hands were shaking. "And if I try to appeal?" she forced out. The officer didn't laugh, didn't smirk, didn't even look surprised by the question. He just shook his head. "There is no appeal, Miss Carter. Mr. Lane has made that clear." Her heart dropped. She had spent years enforcing airline policies, believing that as long as she followed the rules, she would be protected. But now, standing here, she realized something. There was no policy that could protect her from this. This wasn't just about what she had done today. It was about who she had done it to. Daniel Lane wasn't just the CEO of the airline. He was one of the most powerful men in the aviation industry. His word carried more weight than any employee handbook, any corporate policy, any internal review. He hadn't just fired her. He had made sure she would never work for an airline again. Emma took a slow, shaky breath as the security officer gestured toward the exit. "Take care, Miss Carter." And just like that, she was dismissed. She stepped forward, her feet moving almost automatically as she pushed through the glass doors and into the open air. The moment she stepped outside, the noise of the airport changed. The hum of jet engines, the rush of taxis pulling up to the curb, the sound of travelers shouting for their rides. It all hit her at once. She had walked out of these doors so many times before, after long flights, after stressful layovers, after grueling shifts. But this time, she wasn't coming back. Her breath was uneven as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. There were no missed calls, no messages, no one reaching out. Her contacts list felt meaningless now. Pilots, flight attendants, supervisors, people she had worked alongside for years. But now, they wouldn't return her calls. She was toxic. Even if they felt bad for her, they wouldn't risk their own careers to defend her. A sudden, horrifying thought crossed her mind. She opened her email app, her fingers shaking as she scrolled. And there it was, a formal notification from the airline's HR department outlining her termination. The words "conduct violation" were bolded in the first paragraph, but that wasn't what made her stomach drop. At the bottom of the email, there was an attached note, a flag designation in her employee file. Emma's vision blurred. She knew what that meant. She had seen it happen to others before. When an employee was flagged for a major violation, that black mark followed them, not just within the company, across the entire aviation industry. Her name would now appear on internal airline databases as a liability. If she applied for another airline, any airline, her name would trigger an automatic red flag. No company would risk hiring her. Emma sucked in a shaky breath, scrolling desperately through her messages, looking for someone, anyone who could help her. She tapped on a contact, an old supervisor she had once been close with. Someone who had once promised to back her up, no matter what. The phone rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. She tried another, and another. Nothing. She wasn't just fired, she was erased. She lowered the phone, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. For years, she had been the one enforcing policies, controlling flights, deciding who belonged where. Now, she didn't belong anywhere. Her hands tightened around the phone as she stood at the curb, watching taxis pull up one by one. A mother and daughter climbed into the back seat of one, laughing as they loaded their luggage. A businessman in a suit adjusted his tie before getting into another. Life was moving forward, but for Emma, everything had stopped. She had spent so long believing that power came from enforcing rules, but real power didn't come from policies or titles or authority. It came from the people who could take it all away in an instant. She had never been untouchable. She had just never been tested, and now she had lost everything. Emma took a deep, shaky breath, staring at the long road ahead. No job, no future in the industry, no idea where to go next. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. She was just another person standing at the curb, waiting for a ride that wasn't coming. Emma stood motionless at the curb, the cold reality of her situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Her fingers trembled around her phone, but she couldn't bring herself to put it away. She kept staring at the dark screen, as if willing it to light up, as if somehow someone would call her, offer her a lifeline, tell her this was all just a terrible mistake. But no call came, no message, no last-minute redemption. She had spent years in the airline industry, moving up the ranks, believing that her authority made her untouchable. But in less than an hour, she had been wiped away like she had never existed. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to move, taking slow, robotic steps toward the taxi line. It felt wrong. Everything about this moment felt wrong. She had always left the airport in uniform, walking with confidence, head held high, ready to rest before her next flight. But now she felt like a stranger in a place that had once been hers. Her steps slowed as she caught sight of a small group of flight attendants standing near the employee entrance. She recognized them instantly. Crew members she had worked with, people she had trained, people who had once looked up to her. Her stomach twisted as their eyes met. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe someone would step forward. Maybe one of them would ask if she was okay, offer her some kind of support, remind her that she wasn't completely alone. But instead, they just stood there, whispering. Some of them looked at her with sympathy, others with curiosity, but none of them moved toward her. None of them spoke up. They didn't have to. She already knew what they were thinking. They had already distanced themselves. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who had just been personally fired by the CEO. Her throat tightened, and she forced herself to turn away, pretending she hadn't seen them. Keep walking. Don't let them see you break. She reached the taxi stand, gripping the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. A car pulled up, its driver barely glancing at her as he rolled down the window. "Where to?" he asked in a bored tone. Emma hesitated. For the first time in years, she had no answer. Where was she supposed to go? Her apartment? The one she had barely spent any time in because she was always flying? A hotel? A friend's house? Number. She had spent her life living for her career, shaping every part of herself around her job, her position, her authority. She had no life outside of it. She had never needed one. Until now. She swallowed the lump in her throat and finally forced out the name of her apartment complex. It was the only answer she could think of. The driver didn't ask any questions. He just nodded, put the car into gear, and pulled away from the curb. As the airport faded behind her, Emma kept her gaze locked on the window, watching the terminal shrink in the distance. It was strange. She had spent so many years in that airport, watching passengers come and go, sending them off to different places, always knowing that she would be back the next day, ready to do it all over again. But not this time. She wasn't coming back. Ever. A small tremor ran through her hands and she clenched them into fists to stop it. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not now. She had spent years being the one in control, the one setting the rules, the one making the decisions. She wasn't about to fall apart like some pathetic, helpless fool. But then a soft ding from her phone broke the silence. She glanced down at the screen, her pulse spiking for a split second. A message. Maybe someone was reaching out. Maybe there was still a chance. But when she opened it, her stomach dropped. It wasn't a message from a friend. It wasn't a text from a colleague checking in. It was a news alert. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she read the headline. Flight attendant kicks elderly woman off plane. Fired in front of passengers in brutal confrontation with CEO. Her breath caught in her throat. No. This couldn't be happening. Not this fast. Her fingers moved quickly as she tapped the link, opening the article. There it was. A full blow-by-blow account of everything that had happened. Passengers had already spoken to reporters. Some had even given statements, detailing every humiliating second of her downfall. The slap of karma, the CEO's ruthless decision, the security escort, and at the bottom of the article, a video. Her stomach twisted violently. Someone had recorded it. She knew what it would be. The moment Daniel Lane had called for her removal. The moment the security officers had stepped forward. The moment she had been forced to collect her belongings and walk off the plane in disgrace. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second, willing herself not to watch. But she did. And it was worse than she imagined. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to see her stunned face when she realized who Margaret Lane was. Enough to capture the passengers murmuring, whispering, smirking. Enough to see her walking out with her head down, no longer in control. She scrolled down, skimming through the comment section. It was brutal. Good, she got exactly what she deserved. That CEO is a legend for handling it this way. The way she was just erased from the industry, I love it. Emma's vision blurred. There were hundreds of comments already, thousands of views. The video was spreading. This wasn't just the end of her job. This was a public execution. She dropped her phone onto the seat beside her, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her career wasn't just over. Her name was ruined. She could already see what was coming. Employers wouldn't just see her termination in an internal airline database. They would see this video. They would see the headlines. She had gone from being a respected flight attendant to being a viral disaster. The car jolted slightly as they hit a bump, snapping her out of her daze. She had to think. She had to come up with a plan. But as she stared at the city passing by outside the window, for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do. No job, no future, no escape from what she had done. And worst of all, the entire world was watching. The car ride felt endless. The city blurred past Emma as she sat stiffly in the back seat, her mind spiraling with the weight of everything that had happened. The soft hum of the radio was the only sound filling the space, but she wasn't listening. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her phone was still sitting face up on the seat beside her, the screen dim now, but she knew that with one touch, she'd see it all again. The comments, the headlines, the video. She should have put the phone away. She should have shut it off and ignored the growing chaos that was unraveling outside of this car. But she couldn't. Her trembling fingers hovered over the device before finally picking it up again. The video was everywhere now. She opened another article, then another. News outlets were already running the story. The details weren't even exaggerated, because the truth was bad enough. Senior flight attendant Emma Carter publicly fired after removing elderly passenger from first class. Powerful airline CEO delivers swift justice after flight attendant humiliates his mother. Passenger catches moment flight attendant is dismissed in real time. Watch the shocking video. And the worst one. This is what happens when you think you're above the passengers. Her stomach twisted violently. The world wasn't just witnessing her downfall. They were celebrating it. The video had gone viral. Strangers who had never met her, never worked with her, never even knew her name before today were now ripping her apart in the comment sections. Some were laughing, some were furious, some were mocking her like she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. She had spent years building a career in aviation, thinking that her experience and authority meant she was secure. But none of that mattered anymore. She had become a joke, a lesson on what happens when you abuse power, a headline to be shared across social media, analyzed in articles, torn apart in the comments, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The car jerked slightly as it came to a stop at a red light, and Emma realized her breathing had become uneven. Her hands were clenched so tightly around her phone that her knuckles had turned white. She forced herself to inhale deeply through her nose, trying to regain control. 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 The word felt foreign now. For so many years, she had lived by a simple rule: be in charge or be overruled. She had trained herself to be firm, unshaken, respected. She had believed that as long as she stayed strict, disciplined, in control, she would always be on top. But now she was nothing. A nobody. A disgraced employee who had been wiped from the industry in real time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She needed to call someone. Anyone. She scrolled through her contacts again, her pulse racing. Her former supervisors? No, they wouldn't touch this. Old co-workers? They'd already distanced themselves. She tried one last name. Victoria Hale, a former flight supervisor. Someone who had once been a mentor, who had once told Emma that she had potential. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a long second. Then before she could overthink it, she pressed it. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped. Emma's breath caught in her throat as Victoria actually picked up. A small, flickering hope lit in her chest. Victoria, it's me. Silence. Emma swallowed. I know you've probably seen what happened, but Emma. Victoria's voice was carefully neutral. Not angry. Not sympathetic. Just flat. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. Please, she whispered. You know me. You know this isn't how I normally handle things. I made a mistake. I know that. But I need help. You need to move on. Emma's body went rigid. I'm sorry, Victoria said, and this time there was a note of finality in her tone. But your name is already flagged across every major airline. There's nothing I can do for you. Emma's stomach twisted. Victoria, please. You have connections. Maybe if I just explain my side. Victoria sighed. Emma, you don't get it. Emma froze. The industry doesn't care about your side. Her breath hitched. You went viral, Victoria continued, her tone matter-of-fact. Even if I wanted to help, it wouldn't change anything. Your name is toxic now. The words hit hard. Look, I know this is rough, Victoria added after a moment, but the best advice I can give you is to start looking at other careers. Because aviation? A pause. It's done with you. Emma felt like the air had been punched from her lungs. Her grip loosened on the phone, her hands shaking violently. Victoria's voice softened just slightly. I'm sorry, Emma. I really am. Then the call ended. Emma stared blankly at the screen, her mind spinning. That was it. Her last chance. Her last possible lifeline. Gone. The car started moving again, the city rushing past her in a blur. But Emma didn't see any of it. She had never truly considered that this was permanent, that there was no coming back from this. She had thought maybe there would be a way to fix it. Maybe she could talk her way out, make the right connections, prove she wasn't as bad as the headlines made her out to be. But the reality was worse than she ever imagined. She wasn't just fired. She wasn't just erased. She had been exiled. Her life, her identity, everything she had worked for, gone. The car pulled up in front of her apartment building, but Emma barely registered it. "That'll be $32.50, the driver said, sounding indifferent. Emma moved stiffly, pulling cash from her wallet and handing it over. She didn't even bother counting it. She just wanted to get out of this car. She stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the full weight of everything crash over her all at once. For years she had lived for her career. Now she had nothing. She wasn't just unemployed. She was unhireable, a walking headline, a viral disgrace. And worst of all, the entire world had already moved on. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. Emma stood on the sidewalk outside her apartment building, her body feeling like it didn't belong to her anymore. She had spent the entire ride here trying to process what had just happened. But now that she was standing in front of her door, she realized she had nowhere else to go. For years, her apartment had been nothing more than a temporary stop, a place she returned to between flights, a space she barely lived in because her real life had always been in the air. It had never felt like home, and now it was all she had left. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her bag for her keys, fumbling with them before shoving one into the lock. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the crushing silence. There was no warm welcome, no familiar comfort, just empty space. The blinds were drawn, casting faint lines of light across the floor. The air inside was still, stale, like a place long abandoned. She had spent so much time everywhere else that she had forgotten what it was like to be stuck here. She dropped her bag onto the floor and kicked off her shoes, barely making it to the couch before her legs gave out. And for the first time since this nightmare started, she let herself feel it, the weight of it, the finality of it. She wasn't just fired, she was ruined. Her hands moved on their own, reaching for her phone again. She shouldn't check, she knew that. She should turn it off, throw it across the room, anything but this. But her fingers tapped the screen before she could stop herself. The video had now tripled in views. The top comment read, "This woman really thought she was untouchable. Look at her face when she realizes she's done." She scrolled. "You love to see karma in action. She deserved worse, TTBBH. Emma's breath hitched. There were thousands of comments, strangers ripping apart her career, her identity, her entire existence. The worst part, they weren't wrong. She had been arrogant. She had treated passengers like they were beneath her. She had built her career on control, on following rules to the letter, on making sure everyone else knew their place. And yet, when she was the one at the bottom, no one had fought for her. No one had spoken up, because deep down, they had been waiting for this moment. Emma clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. She had two options. She could let this destroy her, or she could fight. She had never been the type to roll over and accept defeat. She wasn't going to start now. Her pulse quickened as she opened her laptop. If the airline industry wanted her gone, fine. If people wanted to drag her name through the mud, fine. But she wasn't going to disappear. She started typing, her fingers moving faster now. Her name was out there. The world was already watching. Maybe it was time to take control of her own story. Emma's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her thoughts racing. She had spent the last several hours watching herself be torn apart by the internet, reading comments from complete strangers who had already decided she was the worst person alive. And for the first time in her life, she had no control over it. That realization hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years believing that power came from enforcing rules, keeping things in order, making sure everyone stayed in their place. She had built her career on structure, on policies, on making sure that people respected authority. But now, she had no authority. She had no voice. She was just a headline, a joke, a cautionary tale. Her name was being dragged through the mud by people who didn't know her, who didn't care about who she was before this. And no matter how many times she replayed what had happened, she couldn't escape one undeniable fact. She had done this to herself. The world hadn't turned against her for no reason. The passengers who had watched her humiliate Margaret Lane had stayed silent because they didn't care about her. The flight crew she had worked with for years hadn't defended her because they didn't want to. And Victoria, one of the only people she had ever trusted in the industry, had made it crystal clear that this wasn't something she could come back from. Emma Carter was finished. She exhaled shakily, forcing herself to sit back in her chair. Her laptop screen glowed in front of her, the cursor blinking, waiting for her to type something. But she had no idea where to start. She had spent her whole life shaping her identity around one thing, her job. Now she didn't have one. She had no backup plan, no other skill set, nothing outside of the airline industry. Everything she had built had been wiped away in less than an hour. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She needed to do something. Anything. Her hand moved toward her phone again, opening a blank message. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed out a name. Ethan Matthews. She hesitated. Ethan had been one of the few pilots she had worked well with. He wasn't exactly a friend, but he had always been neutral. Never one to get involved in gossip or drama. He had worked with the airline for years and, unlike her, had a reputation that was clean. If anyone could help her, maybe it was him. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the message. Hey, Ethan, I know you've probably seen everything. I need to ask you something. Can you talk? She stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. Then she waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Nothing. Her stomach dropped. She had no idea if Ethan had seen the message or if he was actively ignoring it. Maybe he, like everyone else, had already decided to distance himself from her. Her chest tightened, and she threw her phone onto the couch, standing up abruptly. She needed air. She grabbed her keys and stormed out of her apartment, stepping into the cold night air. The streets were quiet, only a few cars passing by, the occasional hum of voices from distant conversations. Her breath came in short bursts as she walked, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She couldn't just sit there and let this happen to her. She needed to find a way to fix this. But how? What could she possibly do when the entire world had already decided who she was? As she walked, her thoughts spiraled. She thought about Daniel Lane, about the way he had spoken to her on that plane, like she was nothing. He had destroyed her career in real time. And the worst part? She had given him the perfect reason to do it. She had been so focused on being right, on enforcing her authority, that she hadn't even stopped to consider the person in front of her. She had spent years treating passengers like they were beneath her, and now she was the one being looked down on. Her own arrogance had put her in this position. Her own pride had made sure no one wanted to help her now. She had built herself into a person no one wanted to defend, and for the first time, she was starting to understand why. Her footsteps slowed as she reached the edge of the block, her breath coming out in uneven puffs of air. Was this who she was? Someone who spent years enforcing rules without compassion? Someone who looked at people and only saw their seat assignments, their boarding groups, their flight status, never their actual humanity? She had built an entire life on authority, on believing that she deserved respect. But had she ever really earned it? She swallowed hard. For the first time, she wasn't sure. Emma stood on the street corner, the cold air biting at her skin as the weight of everything finally settled deep in her bones. She wasn't just jobless. She was a nobody now. For so long, she had believed that respect came with authority, that as long as she upheld the rules, enforced the policies, and kept passengers in check, she was doing the right thing. She had been firm because she thought it was necessary, because she thought that being in control meant being untouchable. But the truth was simple. She had been replaceable all along. The airline had erased her in less than an hour. No hearing, no second chances, no redemption. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She inhaled sharply, her hands clenching into fists before she slowly pulled it out. Her heart skipped as she saw the name on the screen. Ethan Matthews. For a moment, she just stared at it. She had half expected him to ignore her message completely. Maybe he had waited, debating whether or not to respond. Maybe he had even been warned to stay away from her, to keep his distance. But he had answered. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she finally swiped to open the message. Ethan. I saw the news. What do you want, Emma? A lump formed in her throat. She had no idea what to say. What did she want? Her job back? Impossible. A second chance? Gone. Someone to tell her it wasn't as bad as it seemed? It was worse. Her fingers hesitated before she finally started typing. Emma. I don't know where to go from here. She hated how weak it sounded, but it was the truth. The three little dots appeared almost instantly, showing that he was typing. Then the message came through. Ethan. Emma, you don't fix something like this. You start over. Her stomach twisted. Start over. That wasn't something she had ever considered. A new job, maybe. A different airline eventually. But start over? That meant admitting she had lost. Her fingers moved quickly. Emma, you think I don't know that? But how? Where? The airline blacklisted me. Every airline will see my name and drop my resume in the trash. You think I can just apply for some desk job after spending years in the air? His response came just as fast. Ethan. So, what? You're just going to sit in your apartment and wait for people to forget? That's not how this works. You're viral, Emma. No one is going to forget. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. No one is going to forget. That was the worst part. She could handle losing her job. She could handle the humiliation, even the people who had turned their backs on her. But the world wouldn't let this die. Her name was already plastered across every social media platform. People she had never met, never spoken to, never wronged in any way were already judging her, celebrating her downfall, laughing at her. It didn't matter if she deleted her accounts. The damage was done. This wasn't just losing a job. This was losing her entire identity. Her fingers shook as she typed. Emma, so what do I do? What would you do if you were me? This time, Ethan took longer to reply. She imagined him sitting there, debating whether or not he even wanted to waste his time talking to her. And then, finally, Ethan, you have two options. You can disappear, or you can own it. Emma frowned. Own it? What the hell did that mean? Her heart pounded as she typed out a response. Emma, what do you mean? Own what? My life is over. The airline industry won't touch me. No company is going to hire me after what happened. My face is everywhere. I'm a joke. Another long pause. She bit her lip, staring at the screen, waiting. And then, Ethan, that's exactly why you need to own it. Right now, the internet controls your story. You need to take it back. Emma's breath caught. Take it back. She hadn't thought about that. She had been too focused on hiding, on avoiding, on trying to figure out a way to disappear until this all blew over. But it wouldn't blow over. People weren't going to forget. So what if, instead of hiding, she made them see her in a different way? Her hands trembled as she typed her next message. Emma, you're saying I should talk about it? Defend myself? That'll just make it worse. Ethan, not defend yourself. Be honest. Tell your story before they tell it for you. Her mind raced. Could she do that? Would anyone even listen to her? Or would it just give them more ammunition to tear her apart? Her pulse quickened as she stared at Ethan's words. Take it back. She had spent her whole career in control, believing she had the power. She had lost that power the moment Daniel Lane called security. But maybe, just maybe, she could get it back. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart pounding. And then for the first time since this nightmare began, she started typing. Emma's fingers flew over the keyboard, her mind racing faster than she could process. She had spent years in control, holding power over an entire cabin of passengers, dictating who sat where, who followed the rules, who got special treatment. Now she was on the other side, and for the first time, she wasn't enforcing a story. She was becoming one. Her breathing was uneven as she started drafting what could either be her salvation or the final nail in her coffin. She had two choices. She could let the world tell her story for her, let the viral headlines define her forever. Or she could own it. Her hands trembled as she typed. I was fired in front of an entire plane of passengers. And the truth is, I deserved it. She paused. The words felt like swallowing glass, but she kept going. I thought that being strict meant being respected. I thought that enforcing the rules meant I was doing my job. I never stopped to realize that my job wasn't about control, it was about service. I was fired because I humiliated a passenger who deserved kindness, a passenger who did nothing wrong, and I have no one to blame but myself. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to type the next words. I could sit here and tell you that I didn't mean for it to happen. I could defend myself and say that I was following company policy. But the truth? I didn't see her as a person. I saw her as a problem to fix. And because of that, I lost everything. Her hands clenched into fists. She had never admitted to being wrong before. Not like this, she continued typing, the words flowing out faster than she could think. I don't expect sympathy. I don't expect forgiveness. But I do want to be honest, because the internet has already told my story. I want to tell it myself. Her breath was ragged as she finished. She read over the words, feeling her stomach twist into knots. Was this the right move? Would this even work? Or would it just make everything worse? Her thumb hovered over the post button. Her pulse pounded. And then she pressed it. Emma didn't move. Her heart felt like it had stopped completely as she watched the post go live. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the likes started rolling in. The comments, some were brutal. Too little, too late. No one cares about your apology. You ruined your own life. You're only sorry because you got caught. But then, mixed in between the hate, something else appeared. Something unexpected. You know what? At least she admitted it. Most people wouldn't. This is actually refreshing. Everyone always tries to make excuses, but she's taking full responsibility. This is kind of wild. She's literally owning up to everything. Respect for that. Emma's breath hitched. Respect. It was small. It wasn't much. But for the first time since this entire nightmare began, someone wasn't just tearing her apart. She refreshed the page. More comments. More shares. Some people still hated her. Some people still wanted her gone. But others? They were listening. She had no job, no career, no idea what was next. But maybe, just maybe, she had done something that mattered. She had taken her own story back. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from the consequences. She was facing them. That's the end of the story, but I want to hear from you. Do you think she deserved what happened? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.